today's podcast. Our first sponsor is Inside Tracker. Inside Tracker is a personalized nutrition platform that analyzes data from your blood and DNA to help you better understand your body and reach your health goals. I've long been a fan of getting blood work done for the simple reason that many of the things that impact our immediate and long-term health can only be analyzed from a quality blood test. And now, with the advent of modern DNA tests, we can also get insight into things like metabolic factors that tell us whether or not we metabolize caffeine well or certain proteins well, what our fat metabolism genes are like. Things of that sort can only be analyzed from quality blood and DNA tests. In addition, many of the factors that impact our hormones, our metabolism, our brain health, those come back in a blood and DNA test. And there are many blood and DNA tests out there, but with Inside Tracker, they give you a lot of clear insight into what those markers mean and how to adjust them. They have this terrific platform that doesn't just give you the numbers back and tell you if you're high or low in some factor, but rather it tells you what your levels are of all those factors and gives you very simple and clear directives of changes you might make in your diet, changes that you might make in your exercise regimen or sleep, etc., in order to get those markers where they ought to be and where you would like them to be in order to optimize yourself. So they make everything very easy start to finish. They can even come to your home to take the blood and DNA tests if you like. If you'd like to try Inside Tracker, you can go to insidetracker.com/Huberman, and if you do that, you'll get 25% off any of Inside Tracker's plans. Use the code Huberman at checkout. Today's podcast is also brought to us by Belcampo Meat Company. Belcampo is a regenerative farm in Northern California that raises organic, grass-fed, and finished certified humane meats. While I don't eat a lot of meat, when I do, I insist that that meat be of very high quality. How the animals were cared for is extremely important to me, and the life that the animal had and what it consumed is very important to me. So the way that I eat, I've discussed on this podcast before, but very briefly, I basically fast until about noon. Then I eat a piece of beef or chicken with lunch and a salad. So that's basically my lunch. That's what optimizes my levels of alertness for work throughout the day. Then in the evening, I shift over to eating primarily carbohydrates. That's what allows me to sleep very well. So I'm not eating huge volumes of meat, but I am eating meat every day. Conventionally raised animals are confined to feedlots and eat a diet of inflammatory grains, which is bad for them and it's bad for us when we eat their meat. Belcampo's animals graze on open pastures and seasonal grasses, resulting in meat that is higher in nutrients and healthy fats. And I've talked before about the importance of omega-3 fatty acids for both brain and body health. And Belcampo meats are high in omega-3 fatty acids. The way Belcampo raises its animals isn't just better for your health, it also has a positive impact on the environment. It's what's called climate positive and carbon negative, which means good for the planet and good for us. My favorite meats from Belcampo are the ribeye and the flank steaks. That's typically what I eat. I think I probably eat about 3 or 4 of those across the week, and then I'll eat chicken on some other days. They're really delicious, and as I mentioned, they're very good for us. You can order Belcampo sustainably raised meats to be delivered straight to your door using my code Huberman at belcampo.com/Huberman. If you do that, you'll get 20% off first-time order. That's belcampo.com/Huberman for 20% off your first order. Today's episode is also brought to us by Headspace. Headspace is a meditation app backed by 25 published studies and has over 600,000 5-star reviews. So I've been meditating on and off since I was about 15, 16 years old, mostly off at first. What I've found is that I'll sometimes start a meditation practice, but it's very hard to stay with. And then a few years ago, I discovered Headspace and I started meditating more regularly. In fact, very recently, because I've had an exorbitant amount of work on my plate and I've been getting less sleep than I would like in order to complete that work, I've brought back a regular meditation practice twice a day, not just my usual once a day. Headspace makes it really easy. They have so many meditations on there, and they guide you into the meditation and out of the meditation in a way that just makes it very simple and makes maintaining the practice really straightforward. Right now, if you want to try Headspace, you can go to headspace.com/special offer, and if you do that, you'll get a free 1-month trial, so that's totally free, with their full library of meditations for every situation. So there's no meditations that you can't get access to with this offer. You can get access to everything they've got. You just go to headspace.com/special offer. You get a free 1-month trial, and hopefully you'll decide to stay with it. I've found that staying with meditation has been immensely beneficial for all aspects of my life. Today's episode of the Huberman Lab podcast is our fourth and final episode in this month, which is all about skills and athletic performance. Now, in a previous episode, we talked about science-based, in particular neuroscience-based tools for accelerating fat loss. Previous to that, we talked about ways to improve skill learning, motor movements, which also included things like music and piano playing, not just athletic performance. And we've also been exploring other aspects of physical performance throughout the entire month. Today, I want to talk about something that is vitally important for not just athletic performance, but for your entire life and indeed for your longevity, and that's muscle. Now, many of you, when you hear the word muscle, think muscle growth and building big muscles. And while we will touch on muscle hypertrophy, muscle growth today, and science-based protocols to enhance hypertrophy, we will mainly be talking about muscle as it relates to the nervous system. And I can't emphasize this enough. The whole reason why you have a brain is so that you can move. And one of the things that's exquisite and fantastic about the human brain is that it can direct all sorts of different kinds of movement, different speeds of movement, movement of different durations. We can train our musculature to lift heavier and heavier objects, or we can train our musculature to take us further and further, so-called endurance. We can also build smoothness of movement, as well as speed of movement, suppleness of movement. All of that is governed by the relationship between the nervous system, neurons, and their connections to muscle. So when you hear the science of muscle and muscle hypertrophy, you might think, oh, well, I'm not interested in building muscle. But muscle does many critical things. It's important for movement. It's important for metabolism. The more muscle you have, and not just muscle size, but the quality of muscle, that's a real thing, the higher your metabolism is, and indeed the healthier you are. It turns out that jumping ability and ability to stand up quickly and to get up off the floor quickly is one of the most predictive markers of aging and biological aging. And no surprise, that is governed by the brain to muscle connection. In addition, muscle and musculature is vital for posture. And we don't talk about posture enough. We all have been told we need to sit up straight or stand up straight. But posture is vitally important for how the rest of our body works. It's vital to how we breathe. It's actually even vital to how alert or sleepy we are. So we're going to talk about the musculature for posture. We also are going to talk about muscle as it relates to aesthetic things. Now, these are all linked. Muscle for metabolism, movement, posture, and aesthetics, of course, are linked, right? As our posture changes, our aesthetic changes. As our posture and aesthetic changes, how we move changes. And as we improve muscle quality, whether or not that's increasing muscle size or not, that changes the way that our entire system, not just our nervous system and our muscular system, but our immune system and the other organs of the body work. So today, as always, we're going to talk a little bit of mechanism. I'm going to explain how neurons control muscle. And then we're going to look at muscle metabolism, how muscle uses energy. I promise to make all of this very simple. I'm actually going to keep it very brief, probably about 10 minutes total. And by the end of that 10 minutes, you will understand a lot about the neuromuscular connection, how your brain and nervous system control your muscle, and how those muscles work. Then we are going to talk about how muscles use energy and can change how they use energy for sake of getting stronger, if you like, for also increasing the size, so-called hypertrophy of muscle, and for improving endurance, as well as for improving posture and how you move generally. We will touch on some nutritional themes and how that relates to muscle, in particular, a specific amino acid that if it's available in your bloodstream frequently enough and at sufficient levels can help you build and improve the quality of muscle. And we'll talk about specific exercise regimes as well as, of course, supplementation and things that can enhance neuromuscular performance overall. We are also going to talk about recovery. Recovery, as everybody knows, is when things improve. That's when neurons get better at controlling muscle. That's when muscle grows. That's when muscle gets more flexible. None of that actually happens during training. It happens after training. And there's a lot of confusion about how to optimize recovery and how to measure whether or not you are recovered and ready to come back in for another neuromuscular training session. So we'll talk about that as well. Today is going to have a lot of protocols, and you're going to come away with a lot of understanding about how you move, how you work, and these incredible organs that we call the nervous system and the musculature, the so-called neuromuscular system. Before we dive into today's topic, I want to just take about 3 minutes and cover some essential summary of the previous episode. In the previous episode, we talked about fat loss. We talked about shiver-induced fat loss. We talked about NEAT, non-exercise activity thermogenesis, for increasing caloric burn and fat oxidation. And we talked about how to use cold specifically to enhance fat loss. I described a protocol involving getting into cold of some sort, whether or not it's ice bath, cold shower, some form of cold. It could even be a river or an ocean if you have access to that, and inducing shiver and then getting out, not crossing your arms or huddling, but allowing that cold to evaporate off you and continuing to shiver and then getting back into the colder environment of water or stream or shower, etc. All of that is described in a beautifully illustrated protocol that I didn't illustrate. That's why it's beautifully illustrated at thecoldplunge.com. They've made that protocol for you, and they've made it available free of charge for you. So there's no obligation there of any kind financially. You can go to thecoldplunge.com. There's a little tab that says protocols, and you can download that protocol. Someone there, I don't know who exactly illustrated it, and you can come away with a PDF of what I described in the previous episode. So I just want to make sure that you're aware of that resource. The other announcement I'd like to make is that many of you have asked how you can help support the podcast, and there's a very straightforward, zero-cost way to do that, and that's to subscribe to our YouTube channel. So if you go to YouTube, if you're not already there watching this now, hit the subscribe button. That helps us tremendously to get the word out more broadly about the podcast, and we thank you for your support. Most people, when they hear the word muscle, they just think about strength. But of course, muscles are involved in everything that we do. They are involved in speaking. They are involved in sitting and standing up. They are involved in lifting objects, including ourselves. They are absolutely essential for maintaining how we breathe. They're absolutely essential for ambulation, for moving, and for skills of any kind. So when we think about muscle, we don't just want to think about muscle, the meat that is muscle, but what controls that muscle. And no surprise, what controls muscle is the nervous system. The nervous system does that through 3 main nodes of control, areas of control. And I've talked about these before on a previous podcast, so I will keep this very brief. Basically, we have upper motor neurons in our motor cortex. So those are in our skull. And those are involved in deliberate movement. So if I decide that I'm going to pick my pen up and put it down, which is what I'm doing right now, my upper motor neurons were involved in generating that movement. Those upper motor neurons send signals down to my spinal cord, where there are 2 categories of neurons. One are the lower motor neurons, and those lower motor neurons send little wires that we call axons out to our muscles and cause those muscles to contract. They do that by dumping chemicals onto the muscle. In fact, the chemical is acetylcholine. I've talked before about acetylcholine in the brain, which is vitally important for focus and actually can gate neuroplasticity, the brain's ability to change in response to experience. But in the neuromuscular system, acetylcholine released from motor neurons is the only way that muscles can contract. Now, there's another category of neurons in the spinal cord called central pattern generators, or CPGs, and those are involved in rhythmic movements. Anytime we're walking or doing something where we don't have to think about it to do it deliberately, it's just happening reflexively. That's central pattern generators and motor neurons. Anytime we're doing something deliberately, the top-down control, as we call it, from the upper motor neurons comes in and takes control of that system. So it's really simple. You've only got 3 ingredients. You got the upper motor neurons, the lower motor neurons, and for rhythmic movements that are reflexive, you've also got the central pattern generators. So it's a terrifically simple system at that level. But what we're going to focus on today is how that system can control muscle in ways that make that system better. Now, when I say better, I want to be very specific. If your goal is to build larger muscles, there's a way to use your nervous system to trigger hypertrophy, to increase the size of those muscles. And it is indeed controlled by the nervous system. So you can forget the idea that the muscles have memory or that muscles grow in response to something that's just happening within the muscle. It's the nerve to muscle connection that actually creates hypertrophy. I'll talk exactly about how to optimize that process. In addition, if you want to improve endurance or improve flexibility or suppleness or explosiveness, that is all accomplished by the way that the nervous system engages muscles specifically. And so what that means is we have to ask ourselves, are we going to take control of the upper motor neurons, the central pattern generators, or the lower motor neurons, or all three, in order to get to some endpoint of how the nervous system controls muscle. So, Neurophysiology 101. I'll give you one piece of history because it's important to know. Sherrington, who won the Nobel Prize, called movement the final common path. Why did he say that? Well, the whole reason for having a nervous system, the whole reason for having a brain is so that we can control our movements in very dedicated ways. That is one of the reasons, perhaps the predominant reason, why the human brain is so large. You might think, oh, it's so large for thinking and for creativity. No. When you look at the amount of real estate in the brain that's devoted to different aspects of life, it's mainly vision, our ability to see, and movement, our ability to engage in lots of different kinds of movements, slow movements, fast movements, explosive, etc. Other animals don't have that ability because they don't have the mental real estate. They don't have the neural real estate in their brain. They have neuromuscular junctions. They have central pattern generators. What they don't have are these incredible upper motor neurons that can direct activity of the muscles in very specific ways. So we can all feel blessed that we have this system. And today I'm going to teach you how to use that system toward particular endpoints. So if we decide that we are going to direct our muscles in some particular movement of any kind, whether or not it's a weightlifting exercise or whether or not it's a yoga movement or simply picking up and putting down a pen, we are engaging flexors and extensors, and our body is covered with flexors and extensors all over. So, for instance, our bicep is a flexor and our tricep is an extensor. Those are what are called antagonistic muscles. They move the limbs in opposite directions. So if you bring your wrist closer to your shoulder, that's flexion using your bicep. If you move your wrist further away from your shoulder, that's extension using your tricep. And without getting into a lot of detail, the way that the nerves and brain are wired up to muscle make it such that when a flexor is activated, when the nerve dumps chemical, acetylcholine, onto the muscle to activate the biceps, the triceps is inhibited. It's prevented from engaging. There are ways to bypass this, but that's the typical mode of action. The converse is also true. When our tricep is activated, okay, when we move our wrist away from our shoulder, our bicep is inhibited. And we have flexors like our abdominal muscles, and we have extensors in our lower back. Many of you probably know this, but some of you probably don't, that your spine has flexors to move basically your chin toward your waist, and those are your abdominal muscles, among others, and you have extensors that move your chin basically back, like looking up toward the ceiling, and those are your extensors. You have other muscles that are stabilizing muscles and things of that sort, but those movements of flexion and extension and the fact that they are what we call reciprocally innervated or mutual inhibition, you hear different language around this, is characteristic of most of our limb movements. Okay, so hamstring and quadricep. The hamstring brings the ankle closer back towards the glutes. Basically, it's lifting your heel up, right, which is almost always done toward the back. Whereas your quadriceps is the extensor, opposite to the hamstrings. So you get the idea. So there's flexors and extensors, and it's the neurons that control those flexors and extensors that allow us to move in particular ways. So now you have heard neuromuscular physiology in its simplest form, but I do want this to be accessible. I want to get just briefly into some of the underlying metabolism of how muscles use and create energy, because in doing that, we will be in a great position to understand all the tools that follow about how to optimize the neuromuscular system for your particular goals. So in the previous episode about fat loss, we talked about lipolysis, the breakdown of fat into fatty acids so it can be used as fuel. And it ended in a step where we got ATP, which is the bottleneck and final common path for all energy producing functions in the body. There are other ways, but basically ATP is the key element there. Now, with muscles, they don't function on fats normally. What they are going to function on, their ability to move and their ability to do things and allow us to move in any way that we want to, is based on a process of glycolysis, the breakdown of things like glycogen and glucose into energy. And it's a very simple process. You don't have to know any chemistry. So if I say the words carbon or hydrogen or something like that, don't freak out. You don't have to understand any chemistry. But basically what happens is you've got this available sugar resource that's stored in muscle, okay? And that's glucose. And that glucose has 6 carbons and 6 waters, basically. That can be broken down into 2 sets of 3 carbons, all right? So basically you take glucose and you break it into these 2 little batches of carbons that we call pyruvates. So 6 divided by 2 is 3, so you get 3 and 3 pyruvates. And that generates a little bit of ATP, of energy, but just a little bit. Now, if there's oxygen available, okay, if there's sufficient oxygen there, what can happen is that pyruvate can be brought to the mitochondria, and through a whole set of things that you probably don't want to hear about right now, like the electron transport chain and citric acid cycle, what happens is it's broken down and you get 28 to 30 ATP, which is a lot of ATP. So the only things you need to know about this process is that glucose and glycogen are broken down into pyruvate. You get a little bit of energy from that. And when I say energy, I mean the ability to move. It's fuel. It literally just gets burned up. But if there's oxygen available, and that's key, then within the mitochondria, you can create 28 to 30 ATP, which is a lot of ATP. Now, what does this mean? This means that movement of muscle is metabolically expensive. And indeed, compared to other tissues, compared to fat, compared to bone, compared to almost all other tissues except brain tissue, muscle is the most metabolically demanding, which is why people who have more muscle relative to adipose tissue, to fat, they can eat more and they're more of a furnace. They just kind of burn that up. Okay? So even if you didn't understand anything that I just said, what you probably did hear and that I hope you heard is that if you have oxygen around, you can create energy from this fuel source that we call glycogen and glucose. But what if there isn't oxygen around? And what is that like? Well, you've experienced that. I'm not talking about oxygen in the environment. I'm talking about oxygen in the muscle. So if you've ever carried a box while moving, or you were carrying heavy groceries to the car, or you were exercising particularly hard and you felt the burn, well, that burning, which most people think is lactic acid, is actually a process by which pyruvate, which, as I said before, normally could be converted into ATP if there's oxygen. Well, if there's not enough oxygen because that muscle is working too hard or too long, what ends up happening is that a hydrogen molecule comes in there and you get something called lactate. So believe it or not, humans don't make lactic acid. That's in other species. We make lactate. And we think and we hear that lactate is bad. We need to buffer the burn or avoid the burn, that lactic acid and